Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Benson Honig, and I'm representing the Center for Research on Community-Oriented Entrepreneurship and also the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, both of which are sponsoring this talk. And I just want to say a second, clearly appreciation to the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. The issue of Oslo and the Peace Accords is very relevant, clearly, to that center. Some of you might think, why is that relevant to a Center for Community-Oriented Entrepreneurship? And I'll just say that I was working in the West Bank area right after Oslo, doing research on community-oriented entrepreneurship, and discovered a lot of very interesting things about what made some of these small businesses prosper and what some of them didn't. I thought that would be very relevant research and useful research to their community meaning the Palestinian community, as well as the Israeli community. And unfortunately, everything unwound. And so looking at why it unwound and why that disappointing economic opportunity failed is relevant to both centers. We normally open with a land declaration sentence or two. And I'm just going to offer my own land declaration before we move over to the speaker, which is that we're all African. That's where we all came from at one point or another. And we've got some great inequities here in Canada, and we should all think about what we could do in the next year or coming years to help ameliorate the inequities, particularly for Indigenous people. So anyway, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest, Dr. Arnon Degani. He's an amazing scholar, historian on Middle East, Israel, and particularly the Oslo process. He'll be working, hopefully, developing a very, very interesting podcast on that, hopefully to be heard from very soon. But it's really a privilege to have him here, and I think we're all interested to hear what he has to say. And I'll just lastly say that he was invited before there was any war going on in the Middle East, namely 3 months ago, before anyone had any inkling that this would be an important subject. And now, looking at the situation we're in now, I think that what he has to share with us is going to be more relevant, more important for us than ever. So thank you so much, Dr. for coming.
Thanks so much, Benson, and thank you, Professor DeBarros, for hosting me and your respective Center for Research on Community Entrepreneurship and the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. These are humbling institutions to be hosting me, a dumb historian. I'll start. A lecture on this topic has to open with a few words on the war that is going right now in Israel-Palestine. I think it's too early to say what will be the emerging reality, but I think we can say with a level of confidence and certainty, we have entered a new stage or an inflection point. I can say that the Israelis will now look at this time period and read everything that happened before, read the attacks of October 7th to everything towards everything that happened before. This was Hamas all along. This is what they were trying to do, and at the first chance that they had this happen, this will be the way Israelis will look at the situation. Unfortunately, once the war is over and the magnitude of death and destruction in the Gaza Strip will become become clear. Unfortunately, I think the Palestinians will think the same. They will think that this was what Israel was about to do all along. It saw maybe an opportunity in October 7th, but this would be the way Palestinians will read history up until October 7th. And if I could get my sorry. But if we reduce or we essentialize the Israelis and Palestinians to what they've been doing in the last 50 days, we would make it very hard for us to see how we really got to October 7th. In this lecture, I'm going to show that the level, I'm going to expose, to criticize the level, the entrenchment of some frankly illogical narratives that Israelis and Palestinians held towards the Oslo process, a peace process, not a deadly terrorist attack followed by a horrible war. But the ways Israelis and Palestinians look at the peace process is filled with just plain illogical narratives and far-fetched explanations, and it could serve as a warning not to allow these deterministic narratives to set root right now, to the point where we are at right now. So I think that is, if history has anything useful, it might be there. This lecture is based on a research I conducted, historical research with archives and interviews and reading of a lot of secondary sources. The product, though, was not a peer-reviewed article or a book in a university press. It was a podcast, and it played in front of an Israeli audience. It was in Hebrew. You can hear right now if you know Hebrew. And in Israel, just uttering the word Oslo, it condenses, even before 710, but it condenses the word, a story of Palestinian deceit, left-wing Israeli naivete, terrorism on the streets of Israel. That Oslo is synonymous with that. Depolarization within Israeli society, leading to a prime minister's assassination. And above all, Oslo is synonymous with failure. You really don't have to go, you really don't have to go into the details. Just by uttering the word, you're invoking all these things I just said. Look what, if you're saying Oslo, you can handle an entire argument with an Israeli left-winger, for instance, or anyone who's a bit more critical of Israel, I would say. Let's say the occupation of the territories and the Palestinians is cruel. Oslo. A one-state solution has become all but a default. Oslo. More recently now, we can't pretend that the conflict will miraculously subside. Oslo, right? If you're advocating for some sort of political solution, the counterpoint to that would just be Oslo. Let's negotiate Oslo. And the bottom line is that in the Israeli historical memory, the Oslo process, if you have a personal recollection of it, and even if you don't, it's the crown jewel of arguments against a settled two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And by the way, it serves more or less the same purpose in the Palestinian internal debate. And we'll talk more about that later. So going into this research for this podcast, I knew two things. You could call these my biases when entering this research. I knew that the narrative that I will come up with or will produce would have to be different from the ones disseminated by official Israeli outlets, by the about page of the Israeli foreign ministry, for instance, right? And it would have to be different. I'm a historian. I have my job. These people are in the foreign ministry. It can't be the same, right? And also by official Palestinian sources. It will have to be different from those. It will have to be nuanced. It will not lend itself to any clear policy of what to do next. But the best I could hope for is to destabilize certain convictions among people who are a bit more open-minded, not everyone, of course. And essentially, I set out to move away from the national narrative surrounding Oslo and just apply historiographic research on that time period, which has just now entered the historical past, like the 30 years where archives are beginning to open. But the idea that the idea that writing history will look different than the way nation states narrate history, that's not a radical idea. Now, since my narrative is stretched over an eight chapter long podcast, I can't get into the specifics, but I want to point out to you how these national narratives have been adopted by academic figures, by people with professional authority, and that made those narratives thoroughly anchored in the populations, into the Israeli population and the Palestinians. And these narratives, they just don't stand up, not even to historical analysis, again, just logic. And I promise I know I'm talking a tall game here, but I think I'll be able to show you. And I hope this doesn't sound pretentious, but this is a way, I want to show like a view to the historian workshop. How do you deal with an event that's so controversial? So before I start pointing out all the quirks of the established narrative of the Oslo process, let's start with some facts we all have to agree on. And that's also, I know, asking a lot, because when it comes to this topic, not everyone agrees on all the facts, but managed to sum up to 5 or 6 things. Between 1993 and 2000, Israel redeployed its military in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, and in its stead, the Palestinian Authority, headed by Yasser Arafat, took responsibilities over civil administration and services and internal security. Overall control, but the overall control remained in Israeli hands. Okay, so some readjustments of governing happened during that year. Wouldn't be right to say that nothing happened. Wouldn't be right to say that Israel completely withdrew. 2, during this time period, we saw an all-out escalation in the number and severity of Palestinian terrorist attacks by non-PLO organizations, not the ones under Arafat's control, let's say. A record number of Israelis were killed at that time. These are facts. 288 during those 7 years. Fact number 3. Settlements, Israeli settlements and territories were not evacuated during that time. And they actually expanded in numbers and in population. In record numbers, actually, including Jewish settlement in Eastern Jerusalem, which is under international law, a settlement as well. From the middle of the 1990s, we also start seeing illegal outposts popping up, supposedly not sanctioned by the state of Israel. Most of them, more than 90% of them, exist till today. So this is 30 years and 30 years in the making of these outposts that become settlements. So essentially, not only did the settlements expand, but the number of settlements expanded. Between 2000 and early 2001, Israel offered to grant Palestinians a state. Successive better deals, better offers were made, but a state. That's a fact. The Palestinians said no. That's also a fact. That was 4. 5. The process is bookended by 2 intifadas. The first brought the two sides to the negotiating table. The second time, it set that negotiating table aflame, basically. So now that these are, I think, the knowledge that needs to be shared, at least for this debate. The first thing I want to point to you that's flawed in the national narrative of the Oslo process are the two organizing theories. The two, or maybe say, theories of the case. This is, I don't know, never mind. What is the theory of the case? Why did it fail? These theories exist in academia, and they seeped rather seamlessly into the two national narratives. And so one prominent proponent of the Israeli theory of the case, all I had was a picture of him, it's not that important.
Okay.
Is a prominent proponent of this of the Israeli theory of the case is Ephraim Karsh, Professor Ephraim Karsh. He's a professor emeritus from Bar Ilan University, but he's esteemed. He had an appointment at King's College. Serious scholar. He's meticulous. I enjoy his writing, and for him, basically, the theory is as so. Can be summed up by 2 words: Yasser Arafat. That's why Oslo failed. The problem with Arafat was that he basically never gave up on the vision of destroying Israel. Simple as that. Karsh brings many examples of things Arafat did or did not do to prove this intention. Like the clear fact that many more Israelis were killed after Oslo. That is a fact, right? But he also points out, for instance, he also has these kind of more interesting interpretations, like when Arafat was in the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, he wore a uniform. Aha, that's indicative. This person never gave up on being the revolutionary and the terrorist / freedom fighter. So it's compelling, right? It's a compelling thesis to think there's this one guy who just couldn't give up on his life as a guerrilla fighter. But it absolutely makes no sense. It's not logical. It's pointless to argue with the many facts that Karsh brings, because these are facts. All these things that would that Arafat did or didn't do that would contribute to deterioration of the process don't really prove an intent, a malicious intent, that's for sure. Because what Karsh is actually trying to make us understand is that he's trying to reconstruct Arafat's internal psyche, which historians are just inaccessible to. And people are complex, they change their minds, they lie to themselves, they don't necessarily have a great plan, they're trying to survive, they make it up as they go. But if we were to believe that Arafat was plotting all along to use Oslo as a way to facilitate the killing of more Jews, and this is the narrative. This is the agreed upon truth. We would have to assume the following: that Arafat, who ever since the 1970s battled the more purist elements of the PLO to steer the Palestinian national movement towards pragmatism. That same Arafat who fought, shed blood, the Fatah shed blood, these elements in Lebanon to assert Arafat's own prerogative to negotiate with the Americans in the beginning and then with the Israelis, who pressured the entire Palestinian National Council, the kind of parliament in exile, to recognize Israel, and who spoke of recognizing Israel in front of his people, in more than one occasion. We're supposed to believe that Arafat, all this time, was secretly trying to do the opposite. Now, after doing all these things publicly, what could he have done to orchestrate this? Pass a secret note to millions of Palestinians in the territories and the refugee camps saying, stand by, I don't really mean it. The Israeli or American intelligence wouldn't intercept this note. Maybe not after 10/7. We should be more skeptical of the Mossad's capabilities. But the fact is, conspiracies happen, but they can't happen on a large national scale. You can't have an entire nation in on the conspiracy. You can't have millions of people telling them you're going to do one thing and then hoping they get it with a wink that you'll actually be doing the other thing. You can't pursue a national agenda while telling your own nation you are pursuing the opposite. So I'm not saying that Arafat does not have responsibility for the failure of the Oslo Accords. And I'm also not coming to the banal conclusion that both sides share responsibility. Arafat might carry a larger portion of the blame on him. I don't know how to quantify that. But what I am saying is that Arafat could not have followed a clear and thought out plot or ploy when he entered the Oslo process. It's impossible. He made mistakes. He sometimes chose to cater to a national sentiment rather than to the interests of the nation. But leaders do that all the time. And remember, at the end of the day, and this is something I would have to tell Israelis more than I would have to say to a Canadian audience, but you have to remember, he was not a Zionist to begin with, right? If he showed more, if he was tolerable to casualties in terrorist attacks, it's because he was not the Israeli head of state. He was the Palestinian, right? So naturally, he did not live up to Zionist expectation, but he was. He was definitely not. There is no proof that he was thinking about doing the opposite of what he was saying. Karsh concludes with certainty for him having a malicious mindset. I don't see how you can say that. I have not found any evidence. But I also owe you a few words about the Palestinian national narrative and how it was propagated by propagandists and serious scholars like Professor Rashid Khalidi, for instance, who's one of the most fairest scholars within the Israel-Palestine field. He's sometimes very much controversial among Palestinians. He himself is he's Palestinian. He was also part of the PLO, and yet even this, from Columbia University, even this esteemed scholar who I owe personally much for his scholarship, he does not place the blame on a specific character, neither Bibi or Barak, but for him the blame is Zionism. The culprit is the ideology. Zionism, according to Khalidi, and this is widespread, does not allow its adherents to cede territory or forfeit sovereignty to the indigenous Palestinians. Like Karsh, he points to dry facts that you can't argue with that would attest to this inability of Zionists to split the land, and that Israel had never had any intention of granting the Palestinians an independent state. And on that second point, he has excellent evidence, maybe even more convincing than Karsh's evidence of Arafat's malicious intentions. A month before he was assassinated, Rabin went on record in the Knesset saying that what the Palestinians will get in the end is less than a state. Rabin, the big peace guy, not Netanyahu. He also said the entire Jordan Valley. There we go. Zionism's essence, as depicted by Rabin, and this is sort of the map that would probably come out. The entire Jordan Valley will be under Israeli control. And of course, Jerusalem will remain Israeli and unified, the eternal capital of the Jewish people. Another indication of Israeli or Zionist commitment to never granting Palestinians more than just a municipality status is what eventually Israelis offered. That is the first offer in the Camp David map. And to that, you can add the expanding settlements, right? Why have expanding settlements if you're about to leave that territory? So all these things indicate a measure of intent to stay put and really not grant the Palestinians a state. Now, the idea that Zionism will not allow Jewish Israelis to cede any part of Eretz Israel or Palestine is interesting, but it makes no sense as well. It's true, Rabin. If I'm saying that Arafat's public declarations mean something, then I have to say that Rabin's declarations mean something. And he probably did not, at the time in '95, a month before he was assassinated, wanted to give the Palestinians full statehood. But in Camp David, in the year 2000, Prime Minister Barak did offer a state to the Palestinians. Now, that was the first offer. The other offers were better. I can explain why. Maybe we'll do that in the Q&A. Why the Palestinians said no, and I have some very good explanations, but they could have said yes. But Khalidi would have us believe that the Prime Minister Barak banked on Arafat saying no. That Barak thought this would somehow improve his political career or legacy, to be remembered as the Israeli prime minister who was sucker to give Arafat everything and still get a no. In Hebrew, there's this word called flaya, which doesn't nothing to do with Christianity, Christian hierarchy, but being a sucker is like the worst thing to be. So no, Barak gave an offer Arafat could refuse. That was the situation. Barak was genuinely surprised. He said no, and he shouldn't have been, but he was. And did Barak know for a fact that he would say no? There's nothing that would indicate that. So a state was in the offering. And so here's another thing, but also there's another thing to consider. I am an Israeli. I'm also a Zionist. And I believe that a fair deal with the Palestinians would have had to gone way beyond what Barak offered. Years after the Oslo process collapsed, many Israelis believed, and still do, in a two-state solution. Perfectly mainstream Zionist Israelis. Now, one can imagine that if they were in power, people like me were in power in Israel, we would have taken steps in that direction. And there are many reasons why these Zionists are not in power, and we can go into that. But those have nothing to do with the inability of Zionism, of Zionists to share sovereignty over the land. It has to do with contingent factors. So we, or at least I, understand that Oslo's failure is not really that of any side's intention to rob the other side from what they wanted the most. The Israelis wanted security, and the Palestinians wanted a state, or self-determination in the form of a state. Why did it fail is something I get into in my podcast, and any of you know Hebrew, you can find it in all the platforms. But soon we'll be coming out with an English version. We're titling it "Still Processing," like the name of this lecture, and the clever pun. But for now, I'll leave you with a healthy doubt about the reigning common wisdoms on both sides. That I really hope that the point I wanted to convey is that we all should know that Israelis and Palestinians, and I think their respective supporters in the West, are walking around with completely illogical ways of understanding the past of the Oslo process. And I think, and a lot of what has happened since has been built on that. I can stop here, or I can I can show you like an example of how things have happened in the past. We have some time for an example. Excellent. So once I finished the podcast, I received some feedback once it was out, critical of an important omission that I have made. I failed to mention what is known by those that entered the Oslo rabbit hole as the Johannesburg or the Hudaybiya speech. If you Google search in Hebrew or in English or in Arabic the terms Hudaybiya, Arafat, Johannesburg, you'll find some sort of version of the following story. On May 10th, 1994, right after the signing of one of the important agreements, was called the Cairo Agreement within the Oslo process, Arafat attends the inauguration of Nelson Mandela as president of South Africa. Very important moment in world history. During this time, he gives a speech at the local mosque. He's fundraising basically for the new authority that is being created. And he's recorded by an undercover journalist who shares the tape with an Israeli right-wing media outlet, Arutz Sheva. Very right-wing outlet, but nevertheless, it's a tape. The content is explosive, and for 2 points that Arafat makes. One, Arafat calls upon Muslims to join him on a jihad upon Jerusalem. That is a statement that's made. You can see part of it in the subtitles here. And Arafat says that the agreement he just signed in Cairo is like the Hudaybiya Treaty that the Prophet Muhammad signed with his rivals in the Quraysh tribe, and then 2 years later he backtracked and renewed attacks on the Quraysh tribe until he finally defeated them. This reference to something that Prophet Muhammad has done in the 6th century is proof that Arafat was going to do the same thing. Not to put them on the same level of piety. So at the time when this came out, this was I remember this. I was in 10th grade, but I remember this. And made the front pages. Rabin and Paris were very much upset. And Arafat had to make lexical clarifications about the word jihad, what it means, and also to reaffirm his commitment to abandon armed struggle, which he did at the beginning of the Oslo process. Now, had the Oslo process succeeded, then this anecdote might have been completely forgotten. But since it failed, and in the Israeli discourse, it failed because of Arafat's deception. This speech is central. Became a central part of the Israeli memory of what happened during that time. Without really reading the content of the speech, right? I had to go and look at the original speech, and so. Sorry, let me back here. So the speech is like the proof that there was a plot to tell the Israelis something. That was a common refrain. You should listen to what he says in Arabic, because what he says in English is not the same as he says in Arabic, right? As if Israelis don't have people who know Arabic, who could decipher his public speaking. So one thing, so he's telling the Israelis and Americans one thing, and the Palestinians or Muslims or Arabs another thing. And with that other things, those are the real intentions. So all we have to do, according to those people, is just hire a translator. But so what happened here? I went and looked at the speech. Did Arafat reveal his true face momentarily, hoping that no one would record? And he could just not imagine that his room would leave, his words would leave the room. Probably not. So instead of reading the countless accounts of what Arafat said, I actually went to see what Arafat said, and without ellipses or anything like that, just the word, the text itself, and I found out it was not a kumbaya speech by any means. That's true, but the idea that this speech was meant to be heard only about South African Muslims. Just it crumbles under the scrutiny of logic again. But what the Arafat conspiracy narrative also fails to take into account is understanding Israeli public opinion in 1994. So the speech, whose text seems, I would say, rather benign to people, even people very critical of the Palestinians in 2023. But a person, a reasonable person that would read the speech now would not find these words so insightful, because he said, if we don't get Jerusalem, he didn't say, I will treat this treaty as if it was the Hudaybiyah treaty. He said, if we don't get Jerusalem, then this treaty will be the Hudaybiyah treaty. Right? Now, in 2023, the idea that Arafat said, I will never give up Jerusalem, does not sound earth-shattering, right? But in 1994, for the Israelis, it was a big deal. In 1994, the idea that this process would end up with Jerusalem, even part of it, in the hands of the Palestinians, it was preposterous. Nowadays, the few of us, the 20 people of us that think that there should be a two-state solution, we know that in order to move forward, we know Jerusalem has to be shared, maybe split, maybe internationalized. No one's hiding it. Jerusalem is definitely on the table. In 1994, that was not the case. Saying that you were aiming for Jerusalem, for Arafat to say that he was merely trying to get Jerusalem, never mind the Hudaybiyah stuff, right? Could only be heard as Israelis as, I don't want a peace treaty with Israel. And how do I know this? Because in 1996, 2 years after this speech, I'm campaigning for the Labour Party and Shimon Peres against Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud. Here's my proof. This is me hanging a sign for the Labour Party. And I remember distributing this sticker that has here, Israel is strong with Paris. And that sticker has a quote from the book of Jeremiah saying, Jerusalem shall be safely how did I translate it? Jerusalem will be safe. I remember, and we were saying, and Bibi, during the campaign, would say, Paris will divide Jerusalem. And I was so upset because it's a lie. Bibi is a liar. Paris would never. I was so certain of it. This was Barak, in his first offer to Arafat in Camp David, agreed to give a few of the neighborhoods that are right now under Israeli sovereignty. Israel actually annexed these neighborhoods, but these were in the outskirts of Jerusalem to Arafat. At the end, Barak was willing to grant him some sort of status, some sort of status on the Temple Mount. I wouldn't say full sovereignty. And then Olmert in 2008 wanted to internationalize the city, which is something that the Palestinians were always open to. So what seems obvious that has to happen right now was in 1994, no one was thinking in those terms, not even the peace camp. So if in 2001, when Oslo collapsed, Israelis were unable to divide Jerusalem, Israelis. Imagine 1994. And that is why a very feisty, yet not surprising or radical speech, Arafat always said he wants a state in the 67 territories, and he wants Jerusalem as its capital. He was consistent. He wasn't hiding it, right? But that's why a speech like that created such a crisis, and it created a sort of sediment on Israeli memories, right? There is a notion that that during those times in the 90s, Arafat actually said what was his real intentions, but it got out and he kind of and it was swept under the rug just to continue, and that's based on the reaction of the 1994 Israelis, but not on what actually transpired. So it was a rather generic speech reflecting Arafat and the PLO's consistent demands. So we had, like I said, what we have is I was just ad-libbing, but it seems like I wrote it down. We have a memory of a speech that's weighing down on our historical perspective rather than the actual speech. So some final thoughts. Working on this project, I was constantly amazed but how I remembered things differently or didn't remember at all from that time period. And I was rather politically active, even though I was in high school. It made me much more empathetic to Israelis and Palestinians who ironically see Oslo as damaging to their own interests. The narrative that I come up with, it's ironic because every side is convinced that Oslo was good for the other side and bad for their own side. It's an axiom. The narrative that I come up with when I wrote this podcast, it will never catch on as an alternative to the national narrative, and partly because it's just not clear cut, right? It's so easy to say Arafat or Zionism, to have like a simple culprit here. But if we give up as historians on the attempt to be critical of national narrative, and it would make us unpopular among some radical undergrads or powerful conservative lobbies. But if we're not doing our share, as scholars to destabilize these taken for granted truths, then we're not doing the most to prevent the next war. That's it. Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes.
Okay, I had actually questions, but because in the speech you said I'm a Zionist, I read so many things. Since I first of all, I heard somebody how do you define Zionism? What does it mean to be a Zionist? Because I know so much stuff.
How much time do you have?
Stuff being written up in a very simple for a layperson, somebody who just, doesn't know it. When you say Zionism, what does it really mean? Because I've read stuff, but I just want to hear what you have to say.
It's a demand for indigeneity in Palestine. Now, indigeneity is, if you look at my genes, you wouldn't find that they belong to Poland or Eastern Europe or Palestine or anything else, right? Indigeneity is something that is achieved by consensus, by people say, oh, you're from there, right? So Zionism at its most, of course, plural and open and most democratically prone. That's not everyone's Zionism is like that. But at least mine is that I would say I belong to that country. I and other Jews belong to that country, and you'll say fine. That would be the extent of my say. I don't want you to say that it belongs only to Jews. I don't want to say the Jews have the privilege over other groups that are from there, but at least they have that right.
So is it, we say it's a need for authentic, authentic kind of humanness? I mean, like some belongings or something?
Since the world is divided into nation states, right? That is the system right now, right? And that system is maintained by a set of multilateral recognitions, right? So even Iran recognizes the existence of the U.S. and the U.S. recognizes the existence of Iran, even though they're warring, right? So you might say that my demand goes a bit deeper because it but it doesn't. So if you recognize Israel as a state, as an actor in its current constitution, not necessarily its borders, right? Then that's enough for me, at least, right? You don't have. I don't demand the world to adhere to the biblical narrative as reinterpreted 2,000 years later by Zionists, right? I don't need that. But, if there's one country in the world that in its institutions and foundational texts is welcoming to Jews from all over the world, saying this is your country, and that country is a legal and legitimate player in the world arena, in the world system, then that's fine. Some say that the only way to get this is by prosecuting Palestinians or ethnically cleansing them, or even genocide. Some say that. We can argue whether it is or not, but that is obviously not part of my Zionism. And since we're all playing this game of identities, and so who's to say that my Zionism isn't authentic, right? The somehow satisfactory.
I never knew that there were shades of interpretation, so that's fascinating. I don't want to consume other people.
Well, I mean, what ideology does not have shades of interpretation? What complex cultural network is only interpreted in one way? Like a religion, is there one way of in any world religion? Is there one way of practicing, believing, or even so? Same goes for nationalists. What is it? Canadian nationalism, American nationalism.
So what gets reported often is the extreme form of the definition.
Yeah, it's constantly it's contingent. It is malleable, like any other complex ideology or identity. Yes, please.
So in the 1980s, Joe Biden had a famous quote where he said, if Israel didn't exist in the Middle East, we would create an Israel.
Yeah.
Right? Now, what is surprising to me is I think I saw a clip where they've actually showed how consistent it's been, even till I think just a year or two ago when he actually said it again. Within the context of the US's, this unbreakable partnership with Israel.
Right.
So if that is the case, and if that was the sort of the conventional thinking at the time, What are your thoughts around looking at the Oslo process? You know, the thought about whether it would have succeeded or not within that broader context, because I mean, as flippant as that statement sounds, it's what is really saying is that beyond this partnership with Israel, there's a broader American interest with having an entity in that space. So it talks to American foreign policy in the larger scope. And so we see the development of the Oslo process within that broader context. So I know you've looked at the theoretical angles from Palestinian perspective, Zionist perspective, but within this other perspective, have you thought about what, you know, within that sort of lens, what the viability of the Oslo process was in any case, given this broader context where within which it was developed and sort of promoted?
I'll tell you that's a great question. I think it sets my mind spinning. But one of the things I get to in the podcast is an argument made by Israelis, right? Not to mention by Palestinians, by Israelis that were in the negotiating room. Basically, there was almost no daylight between the American and the Israeli positions during negotiations. Again, Israelis say that, not just the Palestinians. Palestinians felt the same way. And some anecdotes that might sound a bit too close for the dual loyalty notion of Americans, Jewish Americans, and their dual loyalty. So not to cater to that conspiracy, but for instance, an anecdote that was told me that when they offered kosher food, then the American diplomats were consumed the kosher food much more than the because there were just so many Jews within in the talks, and all these Jews were self-professed Zionists. Now, inasmuch as Zionism is capable of reaching a compromise, that isn't necessarily a problem. If the U.S. If Israelis, if my claim is that Israelis are capable of sharing the land, definitely in what was offered 78-22%, it's a great deal for Israelis, right? If Israelis are capable of accepting this great deal, which I think they should have done a while ago, then the idea that Americans have the same outlook shouldn't mean that the process was doomed, but it is doomed when the U.S. is the arbiter, right? If the person, I mean, I'm in front of me are some people that are in the world of business, for instance, and so if you're trying to reach an agreement and a compromise, then you might want to have the person mediating to be not have the exact same outlook as, and that definitely hampered the negotiations. But that's not to say that America nowadays we also see that changing maybe a bit. But the reason Israelis were brought to the negotiating table had to do with George Bush Sr., who threatened sanctions, or at least not helping Israel with loan guarantees, which is unthinkable now in American politics. But a Republican president was willing to do that. And so Americans are not. So what Joe Biden says is, of course, indicative, and of course shows a certain commitment in that certain character. That doesn't mean that the U.S. would never be able to be a fair go-between.
I do want to point out there are some online comments.
Yeah, so we have a question here. It comes from Bonnie, who actually founded one of the centers that they're sponsoring you here. And he asked,
Thanks, Bonnie.
His question is, many longstanding conflicts in the world have benefited from a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address deep-seated historical conflicts and injustices. South Africa notably had a TRC to address apartheid, and Canada recently established one addressing historical injustices against Indigenous people. Do you think Israel-Palestine will benefit from a truth and reconciliation process when the guns fall silent?
In the long term, for sure. There's no question that if things are to reach that, eventually peace would be that point. But I don't see how aiming for that as a initial stage will get much traction between the two sides. I think that first of all, the political solution needs to, the framework at least needs to be out there. That even doesn't exist right now. And then gradually, with hoping with the right with the right coordination and ways of implementing and international guarantees for certain aspects of this agreement to be followed through by either side. Once those settle in, and then definitely in order to continue to sustain this situation in the long term, the two societies will have to reconcile on a fundamental level. But I think that the toughest part to get over with, to realize, is that it's okay for this country to for the two peoples to see that country as their own. The borders do not necessarily have to correspond with the national imagination. And if there's a mutual agreement on that, right? If I say that every inch of the country I belong to, Israel, is land that is important to a Palestinian, right? And politics would have it that right now it's my state, but his affinity towards it, saying from the river to the sea, right, wouldn't be as triggering in the future. And same goes for Palestinians. I mean, the people, Israelis are much more likely to present a map of this area as one state, but an Israeli state rather than the opposite. And I hope one day a Palestinian won't find that offensive, right? I mean, currently, because the political meaning behind that kind of image is very violent, but there is no violence, then certain statements will just fall on different ears and will be interpreted differently.
What I really liked about your perspective on all this was just that it's not about trying to get necessarily agreements between two sides. I think often when you're in a discussion, that's what is trying to happen. You see that playing out on social media right now in such a ridiculous way. But it's rather about trying to disassociate the strength of opinion on both sides. And I think that's a really productive, but that's one thing I took away. I don't know, you can correct me if I took it in a different way, but that one line anyway that I think is really powerful is how do we almost weaken individuals' opinions about their stances on these challenging issues. And I think it's not just an Israeli-Palestinian thing that we could do that on, right? But yeah, I don't know. Your thoughts on that weakening process? I
would say that when pitching the podcast, I would say that since it was for an Israeli audience, right? So the end point is to making Israelis understand that the Palestinians were reasonable, right? Not right. The land belongs to us. This is the land of Moses and our forefathers. It all belongs to us. And if we give them an inch of it, it's because we're kind people. Fine, you can believe that, right? But this is how the Palestinians see that. And since they see that, then certain things that you find to be indicative of their almost even say Nazi characteristics, they're not that. That's not that. It was very reasonable for the Palestinians to find Oslo to be disastrous for them. And so once you plant that, you don't necessarily have to go over the endless details and tit for tat. Oh, but look what they did, look what they did, look what they did. No, the other side is convinced of an opposite narrative of yours. You have to understand it as part of the reality you live in. That's speaking to an Israeli, not to you. And so I think you can reach further to the center and maybe even the moderate right, once that is your approach. Yes.
I recall after the Madrid conference in '91, the conversation in the Middle East was the Arabs want land for peace and the Israelis want peace for peace. That at least was the narrative at the time. That the Israelis would say, okay, we'll just grant you peace for peace. And they were not ready to give up any land. And that's what we believe that the intention was. I'm giving you the pulse of the street at the time. And given the way the peace process have gone in the last few years, with major Arab nations signing peace agreements with Israel, and Netanyahu coming to the United Nations and dreaming up of a Middle Eastern future that has no, where the Palestinians have no place in it. You know, that actually is a chilling thought to have. And I'm wondering if the Israeli street, that's a sentiment. You know what? Now we have peace with all these Arab nations. They are on our side. And nobody's going to worry about Palestinians. And that's, by the way, some of the analysis of what's happening.
I agree, yeah.
Is that October 7 actually is a shock to say we are still here. You cannot move along without this. So prior to October 7, was the sentiment in Israel, you know what, we don't need to do the Palestinians anything. We have the peace we wanted all along, and now we're going to have it without giving up any land.
100%. I would say that the dominant prescription for the conflict can be summed up in two words: reducing the conflict or managing the conflict. This is something that the reasonable people would say. Obviously, we can't solve this conflict because two states is out of the question. We're not going to disappear. By the way, if that is the agreed upon, the fact that's in the Israeli national consensus, it assumes that there are going to be Palestinians amongst us. This is not. There were voices from the right that were saying we need to solve this conflict, of course, not through peace, but through gradual deportations. But the dominant theory, and this was Netanyahu's theory, is that we can manage this and we will create progressively better conditions for at the time when Palestinians prove themselves to be a valuable or a honest counterpart. And that proved to be wrong. The Palestinians are not willing to go quietly into the night and have Israel solve all its regional problems and at the expense of addressing their own. So, yeah, it was a very dominant sentiment. It is not. It doesn't overlap 100% with the idea of kicking the Palestinians out. In fact, this vision also assumes the fact that they would remain in the territory, but in a subordinate status indefinitely. But so, you know, it's easy to backslide from apartheid to ethnic cleansing, but these are not the exact same types of violence. Yeah. Any more from the?
So I have a question concerning about the West Bank settlers.
Yeah.
So what are the responsibility of Israeli government on that? Are they directing the settler-colonialism in that region? For example, like you talk about the outposts in the West Bank and like, what are those people exactly? Like, do they voluntarily go there, or they are somehow attracted by a certain type of civil policies, which, you know, like, grant them a land that didn't actually supposed to be belonging to the civil governance of Israel, to a land that is like outside of its border, and which like also offer military protection from the Israeli authorities. So is that like how did that actually works? And you know, what is the solution? What if like Israeli government stopped to provide military protection on those outposts and settlers? Like, so I think that somehow is one of the problems, because like West
Oh,
Bank
yeah.
is also, there are many Palestinian towns within, and like the settlers are trying to curve up their own routes, like building up their own roads, like connecting each other, which you curve up the original, you know, domestic land, which you already have those cities that last for 1,000 years.
Let me stop you there. I think I understand what you want me to address, for instance, right? How do I, what kind of agent are the settlers, right? Are they agents? Are they independent, and then they are sabotaging the process and or processes after Oslo? Or are they emissaries of the Israeli state and indicative of its policies and its intentions, right? So the answer is that, you know, it's complicated, right? On the fundamental and legal level, they are Israeli citizens. If Israel wants them out, it could have them out. Maybe politically that's right now impossible, but again, they were placed there by Israel. They are protected by Israel. 100% they are part of the Israeli state. They're not they're not pioneers that had enough of Israel and are now trying to build a new Jewish state in new territories that's independent from Israel. They see themselves as the ones expanding Israel's borders, right? But in the sense, they're a bit more colonial than they are settler. But never mind how we characterize them. I can say that definitely the expansions of settlements, which is something that I mentioned, is something we have to know, right? Israelis have to know that during the Oslo period, not one settlement was evacuated. In fact, more were built. And this is not something that Israel, right? But if you kind of dig deep into this relationship between the states, you can see that within the leadership, the settlements were, we can deal with that later. And since they are noisy and politically, and they have some sort of popularity because of their pioneering ethos, let's not go head to head with them right away. Let's strike a deal. Once we have a deal, we can get rid of them, right? And again, a prime minister paid with, and so, you know, a prime minister paid with his life for antagonizing the settlers. So there was this idea that during the negotiations, it's not worthwhile spending political capital on downsizing and starting to strangle the settlement project. Remember, there were settlements in Sinai, all were evacuated, given and territory was given. So what settlements meant for Israelis and the Israeli leadership wasn't exactly what it seemed to the Palestinians. I can't say which one was the right way of looking at it, but it is reasonable for a Palestinian to look at buildings being built, playgrounds being built, schools being built, and say, oh, they're not going to leave ever, right? But in the Israeli consciousness, just by saying that not one settlement was evacuated would come to a lot of people as a surprise. Oh, I thought we kind of went back during the 90s with settlements. Thought we kind of, no. They expanded. So that is what close scrutiny and reading of the data, this is not like the grand narrative, the theory of the case, right? But if you really want to understand, Israelis and Palestinians saw things differently at the time, not just in the past.
Your question? Yeah, correct. You know, time we have.
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Okay, so good. Okay, so nice. Okay, so recently I came across an article I was just reading in Middle Eastern Studies, by maybe you might find it. His name is Simon.
Maybe Shimon.
Simon Panther.
Okay, one second, I had it saved. Anyway, so in that context, that article, he just ends by saying what we, because Gandhi at various points was asked immediate this question at one point. And in a way, there's a fascinating phrase that was there, I can show you the article. He talks about the concept of Arab goodwill. So what are your thoughts? Do you think there is an Arab goodwill?
No.
And because that leads to two questions I read, because often when you read the news and the headline stuff, and it looks very kind of violent images and, barbaric, people, you can't even stand near them because they're going to bomb themselves and so all kinds of stuff. So that is the context. So the phrase Arab goodwill, what are your thoughts on that?
I would
what you
I
said.
try to avoid grounding historical explanations on presumed essential traits of people. It's just that even if you look at a queue for I don't know, a falafel in Israel, in Jewish Israel, and if you look at the queue in London, maybe, right, you would see vastly different behaviors. To correlate between that and a way of approaching bilateral relations with an enemy state or an enemy, I don't know how one can we're not in the US. I know that frequently the idea of honor is evoked when trying to understand Arabs, right? What makes them. If you look at the US, it invaded an entire country because it felt bad about 9/11 that had nothing to do with Iraq, right? So I don't see the idea of honor or humiliation to be more animating for Arabs and less animating for the West. It's in certain time points, and so a concept like an Arab goodwill, as if it's different from a Jewish goodwill, or there are differences in behaviors, maybe even political thinking, but these are all within history, can be explained by events, economic interactions, rather than anything that's you could even that even holds water. What is Arab goodwill? I wouldn't base a theory on a concept which cuts off Arabs from the rest of humanity because they have their own goodwill. That's not how I do things.
It's very technical because you invoke the idea of West and so on. There's absolute elements of at least in the school system and things like that. So phrases and what do they mean? So I have two questions.
Okay.
First of all, what are the etymological roots to the word anti-Semitism?
You'd have to ask a linguist.
But honestly, it's such a big thing right now here.
Look, Semites. Not. I wouldn't even know what the etymological roots, but I can even say that the signifier and the signified between the signified behind Semites changes over time as well. What is a Semite? So this is beyond my capacity to answer. I really don't know. I really don't know. If you want to ask about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, right? If you want to ask about that, maybe we could talk about it. I don't want to be canceled.
The Middle East and so on, but
yeah, but for Arab goodwill, is there an Indian goodwill? I'm assuming your identity.
yeah, correct. In fact, some of the questions are motivated by the history of India and present day India.
So is there like a particular Indian way of thinking that has that has determined Indian history for 10,000 years? Is there?
Not really.
So why would there be? Why would Arab goodwill be, a causal explanation for anything? Is there like the Israeli way of thinking? There is no, right? We're at each other's throats all the time. So
And again, because you go in the Indian history, but at various points you said some of the nuances so that everybody thinks about, oh, the two-state solution. But is there in the literature or in the popular or among the scholars, in the more serious, for example, is there a viable one-state solution? Because I go back to the Indian subcontinent, because the Pakistan-India partition, there's so much chaos that has happened and so on. The one-state solution where everybody can profess a multicultural, multi-ethnic, as in historical terms.
You're asking lofty questions, and I can point out to very concrete facts. One state solution invokes the South African path, right? That at a certain point, the two warring sides will just share the same polity. They will have the same political voice. They'll be able to vote. One person, one vote. That was now. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's good. But if this is not the solutions that the Palestinian, not talking about their allies here in Canada or the US, look at the actual Palestinians. If there is no one political movement, right, that is advocating, there's no ANC, there's nothing equivalent, right, amongst the Palestinians. Why would anyone entertain that? Seeing if you see the situation like me as the Palestinians who deserve the most, whose situation needs to be remedied the most, even more than Israelis, right? This is how I see the situation, right? Israelis at least have a state. They're not safe in that state, but they have a state. Palestinians don't even have that, right? If they're the ones that need to be remedied, and they're not, and there is no significant grassroots political organization that's invoking that, then I don't understand why are we even talking about this all the time. The idea, I'm not talking about you can't have Jews and Israelis, Jews and Palestinians living in the same country. I'm not talking about Jews need to have their own state, their own ethnic. I'm not talking about all these things. If the Palestinians have institutions, they have organizations, they have a voice, they have made that voice very clear in 10-7, like Imad suggested. This was a way of Palestinians saying it was a horrible way of doing things, but it was a way we will not go quietly, right? That is not, if you're right, once the ANC in 1955, the charter, the Freedom Charter, said that South Africa belongs to everyone, white and black, right? That kind of declaration does not exist. I'm not asking the Palestinians, but there is no Palestine belongs both to Jews and Palestinians. That's not out there. Once it is out there, we'll have 50, maybe 40, 50 years, and then we'll have one state. But the hourglass hasn't even turned because that statement hasn't been made. Again, if it was up to the pro-Palestinian people in the West, we'd have a one state tomorrow. But they're not the ones that are calling the shots, right? So, and in Palestine, if there we're going way, this is very far away from. You can tell I'm passionate about these issues, but if Palestinians, if there are any Palestinians who are willing to accept the kind of Jewish presence in Palestine that I want, right? I want not just to live there as an individual. I want the idea that this country also belongs to the Jews, right? So in as much as you have people who are willing to live with that reality, they want two states, not one. By bigger numbers. And of course, there is a significant a significant amount of Palestinians who don't want Jews there, not maybe at all, but with any kind of collective rights. So those are the dominating political agendas. If the one state agenda becomes salient, we're in a different reality at that point. But it just hasn't happened.
Okay, we've just about run out of time, but I want to thank so much Arnon Degani for sharing. It came at a perfect time because things are super chaotic right now, but we have a small gift of thanks to you from the two research centers, and thank you very much for listening, and thank all of you for attending, both those of you here and those of you virtually, and again for the two centers, and let's continue doing this important work. And the most important thing we can do at McMaster is to talk about these issues, to create dialogue, and to talk to each other, and I'm really pleased to see that this went exactly the way it should. So thank you again for attending. And again, appreciate your help. Thanks so much.